Welcome, everyone. My name's Eliza Canty-Jones. I'm with the Oregon Historical Society, and we're so excited to be able to participate with tonight's program. This program was originally scheduled to be a conference presentation at the PCBAHA, and that's the Pacific Coast branch of the American Historical Association. For many years, the historians of the West have been hosting their own American Historical Association conference, and that should have happened just a couple of weeks ago here in Portland, Oregon. For obvious reasons, it's not happening. Maybe we'll all get together here in Portland next year. Maybe we won't. But in the meantime, we're really so pleased that these four intrepid scholars have decided to present their amazing knowledge and finds publicly here with us this evening. So I'm located here in Portland, Oregon, which is the traditional homelands of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, and Tumwater, Watlala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin Kalapuya, many other nations, indigenous nations of the Columbia River. And we at the Oregon Historical Society, like many individuals and organizations, always like to take some time to really think about the ancestral and ongoing relationships of the indigenous peoples of the places where we are. No matter where you are in the United States, you're on indigenous land, and there are peoples who are indigenous to the place you are, and they have for many hundreds or thousands of years tended and shaped that landscape and had relationship with it and continue to live there, and it's worth and important to learn about that history. So as you can imagine, the Oregon Historical Society and our online resources are great places to learn about that. So we encourage you also to check out the tribal museums and tribal websites wherever you are and learn about those indigenous people. My organization, the Oregon Historical Society, has a mission to preserve our state's history and make it accessible to everyone in ways that inspire curiosity and advance knowledge about all the peoples, places, and events that have shaped the state of Oregon. There is almost no better way to think about learning about people, places, and events in the past than through beer. So I'm really thrilled to have tonight's speakers with us. The way the program will work is each of these people will present, and then I will take questions from the chat or from the Q&A, so you can use both of those. And then after the presentations, I'll start fielding these questions to folks. Thanks to Sarah, who's put up a very important slide to remind me to let all of you know that we have an incredible program coming up from the Oregon Historical Society. Professor Erica Lee, who is a nationally renowned scholar of immigration, has written an incredibly important new book, America for Americans, A History of Xenophobia in the United States. This program will be offered virtually on September 8th at 7 p.m. Pacific time. We really encourage folks to go online to ohs.org/Hatfield and purchase a ticket to be able to watch that program virtually. It is a really deeply fascinating book, and I'm sure that the talk will be incredible. So really encourage you to join us for the Erica Lee lecture on September 8th, coming right up. Okay, so, and then someone did ask, yes, we will be recording this and we'll make it available on the OHS website and perhaps other places later. Oh, so many wonderful beers in the chat. Thanks everyone for sharing those. Okay, our first speaker tonight is Tiah Edmunson-Morton, who started the Oregon Hops and Brewing Archives at Oregon State University's library in 2013. It is the first archives of its kind in the United States. She teaches about library and archival research. She manages the Special Collections and Archive Research Centers, exhibits, and internship programs, and she coordinates the social media and outreach. She has an MLIS from San Jose State University, an MA in English Literature from Miami University, and is a certified archivist and fantastic person. So Tiah, take it from here.
That little last one was an addition. Thank you, Eliza. I'm delighted to be here. The fact that we are doing all of this at our homes or our offices, I feel very fortunate. So thank you all for joining us. I've been at OSU since 2006, which feels like a very, very long time now. As Eliza said, I started the Hops and Brewing Archives in the 2013. It was the first of its kind in the country. 2013 is also when I met Peter, and we're old hats at presenting together. I'm not sure how many times we've presented together, but all the other times we've been in the same room and the same state and closer to each other than we are now. So it's exciting to have that possibility too. I'm on Twitter at Brewing Archives for anyone who is excitedly live tweeting this. And online you can find me with the search for Oregon Hops and Brewing Archives. And I'll drop that some links in the chat when I'm done. This talk, maybe you've heard of her husband, Finding Eliza Neihart, is based on an article for the Oregon Historical Quarterly that I'm working on revisions for right now. Tonight, I will talk about women in brewing in Oregon, but first I want to talk about silence. Next slide, please. Archives and records repositories are filled with voices. We visit them to learn about our families, past actions of governments, and the activities of private organizations. But they're also spaces that reflect power and document the dominant narrative. Decisions are made by creators, by archivists, by researchers about what to include and who to exclude from that narrative. The result can be omission or distortion or erasure. And so for all the voices recorded in an archive, there are also many voices that have been silenced. And anyone who has done research, historical research on women knows this. Women's voices weren't actually hidden. More often, they just weren't recorded. The history of 19th century women's work is often told through the story of their husbands or their sons. They were categorized as women and mothers rather than business partners or owners. One issue that I always cite, I always talk about when I'm talking about researching women are these complications surrounding their very names. If their first name was recorded in a newspaper and wasn't just Mrs., actually finding their maiden names to track their genealogy back from the point before they were married to their husband feels sort of like dumb luck if you actually get a maiden name. So just the very act of trying to research women is difficult from a name standpoint. Next slide, please. Most, basically all, brewers in the 19th century in Oregon were men. But as I explored beer history more, I found that the stories of early Oregon women and their work in brewing or related to brewing they were fascinating stories. In my research, I found that most of the women who were linked to breweries weren't making beer, but I suspected that they still played a really essential role in businesses' success. They may have run the household, they did child minding, they may have done the books, they may have participated in community events, etc. And I knew that several of the women who were highlighted as linked to breweries ran the brewery for a time after their husbands died. Whether they brewed or not, I don't know. I haven't found any direct evidence of that. I was preparing for an oral history in 2016 with Dana Garves, who owns Brew Lab and is the former brewing chemist at Ninkasi down in Eugene. And I found a blog post that she'd written called Oregon's First Women Brewers, 1879 to 1908, which included some names and locations of women that she called brewers. I've since found photos of 3 of these women, which is not always easy. So I'm delighted to share them. Frederica Vetterer on the left from Jacksonville, whose obituary was actually in the Oregonian. She was from Southern Oregon. Her obituary was in the Oregonian, and the picture of her in her obituary is like one of the worst pictures of anyone kind of ever. And so this is a delightful picture of her post. She also, in her obituary, did not have, she was married twice. Her first name was not in the obituary anywhere. She was Mrs. first husband's name and Mrs. second husband's name. I digress. Mary Allen is in the center from Monument, Oregon, and Marie Kindlin is on the right, one of my favorite characters from Southern Oregon. Garves also wrote about Teresa O'Brien, who is on the North Coast, and Mary Mayle, who is on the South Coast. And in my own research, I added several names, including Catherine Stahl from Eastern Oregon, Margaret Beck from Capital Brewing in Salem. She ran it for a long time, actually. And Louisa Kiefer from Albany, who was also Frederica Vetterer's sister. Next slide, please. But I wondered, and you may wonder, is there a way to determine the jobs that they did or the roles that they actually played in the businesses? So I've done a lot of online newspaper searching, and I've done a lot of on-site research in the places where these women lived. And the short answer is no. There were lots of variables in terms of family structure and marriage and name and geographic location and brewery size. And really the available documentation makes both specifics and generalizations really hard to draw. But Henry Weinhardt, he's a pretty familiar name, even outside of Portland, Oregon, or the Willamette Valley. And his business was extremely successful and lasted a very, very long time. And I was certain that researching his wife would be a snap. It would be an easy win. It would be good practice for future work on other women that identified that I talked about earlier. And I was really, really wrong. So it turns out that the records for the Weinhardts are scant. They are limited to newspaper articles or advertisements, to government records, lawsuits, and for Henry, glowing short biographies in what I call books about great men. She was mentioned in them, so that was great, but she was his husband or his wife. That was it. So I dug. And this is me when research is new and you're really excited and I feel like a beagle, and then the pit of being lost is on the right. We all know what that feels like. Next slide, please. So this is Louisa, the woman who had that very famous husband. And although she was famous in her own right for her generosity, as well as her involvement in local church and aid societies, Louisa's legacy is marked by details. There are lots of odd details, but mainly silences. Not to jump to the end of the story first, but the fact that I have this picture is a true testament to my Googling superpowers. So I had scoured archival collections, newspapers, and books because I really, really wanted a picture of her. It was really important for me to know what she looked like. And I failed. Finally, I used the string of search terms. I wish I could remember what it was, but I can't remember. I found a reference to in 2015, to a 2015 article, to a portrait in an article about a remodel that happened at Portland Community College. And days before I finished the first draft of my article, I emailed their community relations manager and I said, hey, do you have this? And she said, yes. And she sent me a picture of the portrait, and it sat on my desk, and it still sits on my desk. And I carried it around on my phone, and I showed people, and I talked about Louisa constantly. And we actually are going to have this portrait of Louisa and a portrait of Henry transferred to us. And I was supposed to go pick up the portraits the week that everything closed. So they are still there. And that is sad. So I want to talk about Louisa, though, not just about my Googling and her portrait. Louise Wagenblast was born in Germany in 1832. She lost her mother when she was 4. She was one of 14 children. She traveled to Missouri at 15, arrived in the Northwest at 23, and married that man who would become very famous when she was 27. By the time she died at age 85, she had buried her husband and 4 of her 5 children. Through online genealogy sites and local history sources, I pieced together details about her family's move from Waldrons, Germany, a small town about 300 miles southwest of Berlin, to Missouri, and then to Oregon. Although she traveled to Oregon by ship, her brother Gottlieb journeyed with the 1855 wagon train led by Dr. Willem Keel, the founder of Christian communal settlements in both Bethel, Missouri, and Aurora, Oregon. And I will say thank you to Peter's dad, James, for his work on utopian communities in Oregon, because I spent a lot of time thinking about whether, or trying to tease out whether she was part of the colony or whether her brother was. They weren't, but they traveled, her brother did travel with the wagon train over from Missouri. Through government records, I learned when she was married to Henry, when her children were born, and in census records and newspapers, I found documentation of the family moving back and forth across the Oregon-Washington border. He had a brewery in Vancouver, Washington for a time. And through the census, I learned who her neighbors were, how old her children were every 10 years, and if she had servants living in her home. While the dates and names are recorded, what isn't recorded is the scope of her loss, which at times feels immense. Her son, Christian Henry, died in 1863 when he was 2. Her daughter, Emma, died in 1864 when she was 18 months. Her daughter, Betty, died in 1882 when she was 13. Henry himself died of kidney disease in 1904, and just a year later, her adult daughter died at 32 of heart disease, Louise Wagner. Her only child who survived her was Anna Wessinger, who was 87. However, mentions in newspaper articles gave me significant and a somewhat intimate glimpse into her life through her community activities. She sent roses to the 1904 Portland Rose Society annual show and 30 pounds of sugar to support unemployed men at the Gypsy Smith Tabernacle. She donated $100 to a benefit fund to purchase artificial legs for an actress, Marjorie Marr, who had lost her legs in a railway accident. And when 13-year-old Urvilla Smith arrived at the Weinhardt house in the middle of the night in 1905, after being assaulted near the Lewis and Clark Expo Fairgrounds and left on the street by a saloon, the family welcomed her, called the doctor and police, and, quote, while Mrs. Weinhardt got her something to eat and made her comfortable for the night. She was a member of the Portland's Women's Union and sent money to the Louise Home for Unmarried Mothers and the Albertina Kerr Nursery Home. And in the last weeks of her life, she offered money to a woman whose husband was in prison in California so the woman could visit her. I have lots of stories, and I could go way, way, way over my time. And I could share things about Louisa's siblings. I can talk about prostitution and vice. I can talk about women's clubs. I can talk about their wealth. But I found the most detail actually at the end of her life. And so I'm going to tell you a couple of stories about how she used her wealth and position at the end of her life. Next slide, please. In the years following Henry and Louisa's death, it's difficult to determine how involved Louisa was in the brewery and family estate business. Maybe no more than just in name, because she was an executrix of the estate. What is clear is that she continued to support her German community. The most significant was her donation of a 20-acre lot in Southeast Portland worth $30,000 to build a retirement facility for elderly Germans to spend their final years, quote, among their own people. The Altenheim was to be, quote, the most important of its kind in the US, and newspapers reported that she also wanted residents to take advantage of fresh air, good water, and rich soil. And because she valued work, she also wanted, quote, helpful occupations for charges, and imagined the home would be partially self-supporting through farming. In 1911, with 2,000 people present, the cornerstone was laid, and it contained pictures of both Henry and Louisa, as well as copies of Portland's German newspapers and other daily newspapers. Louisa's great-grandson talked later about a picture that he knew of in the newspaper of Louisa at the May 1912 dedication in an open carriage with the mayor of Portland, and he described her as looking quite like Queen Victoria, quote, very short and very fat. That's the picture you see here, a find made possible by the University of Oregon's historic newspaper site. I learned more about Louisa from the news coverage of the Altenheim than in most previous articles about Henry or the business. Beyond this tone-deaf comment about her appearance, I learned that she valued work, self-sufficiency, and cultural traditions, but also that she was part of a community that felt isolated from the rest of Portland. But what we don't hear are her words. In all the press coverage regarding the Altenheim, there isn't a single quote from Louisa. The Altenheim closed in 2003. The building housed the German American Society offices until the property was sold to Portland Community College in 2010. And this is where her portrait is waiting for me. Next slide. Louisa died in Portland on April 23rd, 1918, and was buried at the Riverview Cemetery. She was 85 years old, had been in America for 71 years, and Portland for 63. News of her death was carried in several papers. W.G. McLaren, the general superintendent for the Pacific Coast Rescue and Protective Society, wrote a letter to the editor that was an unfettered tribute to her good works and the hidden nature of her charity. He said that during the hard times of 1907, she bought $100 worth of tickets for the Portland Commons and distributed them among men, quote, who were out of work and in need of food and lodging. He went on, quote, she gave me orders that I was not to allow any unfortunate person to go away hungry and agreed to meet the expenses of feeding them. He continued, "There was never a case of a mother or child in sickness or distress that Mrs. Weinhardt knew of where she would not give assistance," and concluded, quote, "that she was a good woman with one of the best hearts where human suffering was concerned that I have ever known. I believe that the people of Portland should know something of what she did during her long residence in this city for the benefit of humanity." This last sentence feels like a final reminder that she gave freely to charitable causes and individual people, not for personal recognition, and maybe not even for our historical record, but for the purpose of bettering others. Next slide. In researching Louisa, I found a handful of touchingly personal details that I couldn't actually verify. The Weinhardt supposedly had a house in Astoria and a 620-acre farm in Yamhill County. An Oregonian article written in 1954 when Louise Wagner's home was being demolished noted a 4-foot stained glass window with a woman sipping wine from a glass, which I love because, well, it's the constant joke is that I'm a beer archivist who likes wine. So this 4-foot stained glass window is said to have been installed by Louisa Weinhardt as a gift to the house, with the house. The names Henry and Louise or Louisa are handed down to subsequent generations in their family, and Louisa herself was immortalized in Brewery Block 2, a 242-unit high-rise residential building built on the location of the original Weinhardt Brewery in Portland. But the last little bit of sparkle to this story is a connection that I made with one of her descendants on Ancestry.com. I found Lizzie Hart, her great plus granddaughter, which had her profile, which had pictures of Louisa's granddaughter and Lizzie's own grandmother. I wrote to her and I said, "I'm an archivist. I have this picture of your relative, and I've written this article about her. Would you like either?" And so fortunately, she wasn't super creeped out by this, which I might have been. Instead, we've had this lovely ongoing correspondence, and through that, she's given me more personal perspectives on the Weinhardt family and validated my work in this area. My research has added a dimension both to the story of women in her family and her own personal understanding of how she fits into it. Her family story was the story of men. I can't end with a quote from Louisa, but I can end with one from Lizzie. She wrote to me, "What you are doing in your work, the recovery of women's stories, painstaking as it may be to grapple in the dark room of a dominant narrative, is such an important task to undertake on behalf of our futures." Thank you.
Yay. Thank you so much, Tiah. And that's really, I love the sparkle, really appreciate that. Our next speaker is Braden Neihart, who is a beer historian interested in 19th century Colorado brewing and wrote his master's thesis on 19th century Denver breweries. He currently works at the SDSU Research Foundation. So please join me in a big, quiet Zoom welcome for Braden.
How's it going? My name is Braden Neihart, and I'm currently drinking a vanilla porter from Breckenridge Brewery. I'm in San Diego, and so it's difficult to find lots of Colorado beer, but that was what I found, and I'm going to use it as a prop later on, so I'm pretty excited about it. My talk here is about mountain ale. It's about brewing in the Rocky Mountains, and I wrote my thesis on Denver breweries, and at the time I was focusing on Denver and the beer produced there, which is on the Front Range, which is a different region of the mountains. And what I wanted to think about here today is what would beer have looked like in the mountains? What would brewing have looked like in the mountains at altitude? It's a very different environment. And I want to give a big thank you to my wife for helping me both organize these slides and also helping organize my thoughts here. They would have been quite rambling. We would have gone on for a lot longer, and not just because of the beer. But I started to wonder a little bit more about mountain beer. And so we go to the next slide. What started this was this advertisement. If you see in the highlighted section, it says mountain ale for mountain people. And this was an advertisement in late 19th century Denver in the 1870s, advertising this mountain ale. And so this is what sparked this. I came across this when I was doing my thesis, and Mount Washington House wasn't a brewery, it was a tavern, so I didn't want to include it. But it made me wonder more about mountain brewing, what challenges they would have had, how it would have been easier almost than in the city. I wanted to wonder about regional differences in Colorado. Colorado has very distinct regions within it, and I wanted to know more about how beer can either help us understand those regions better or how it might elide some of the differences between people. And I want to think about how beer could flow both east and west in Colorado, and how it could be just this kind of this bridge or this barrier, or how it functioned between the mountains and the plains and all these different regions. And so if we go to the next slide, this is a quick rundown of Denver, Colorado politically. You can see Denver in the top middle area there. As you can see, all the highways run through Denver. Denver is the city or the state capital. It was very early on the most populous city. In 1859 is when the Colorado Gold Rush happened. When Colorado became a state in 1876, Denver was the state capital, and it very quickly became the central hub. You see lots of other cities here which are important. You see further down there's Pueblo. If you take I-25 straight south, there's Pueblo. And this line here is called the Front Range, where a lot of the major cities were established to supply people up in the mines. If we go to the next slide, we have the political map again, and here's the geographic map. So you see where the I-25 road north-south runs pretty much along the Front Range of the mountains there. To the right-hand side or to the east are the plains, and then the dark brown mountains, I guess, are what we call the high country, or the Rocky Mountains. And then further west is the western slope. But I want to talk about the dark brown middle section there, which are the Rocky Mountains, and how brewing would take place there. Now, we know quite a bit of brewing was going on in the mountains during this time. Leadville, Georgetown, there's a number of other cities that had breweries there that were functioning and produced good beer for their local communities. I don't know how much actually went outside, but there's a brewery in Leadville that went from the 70s to early 1900s, where they produced lots and lots of beer for their city, and it were pretty major staples in that area. And so if we go to the next slide, here's a quick rundown of the brewing process. You need grain to ferment beer. You get grain, you kind of germinate it, you put it in a kiln to create your malt, put that in some water, soak it for a while, boil it, and that becomes your beer. You also can add hops for flavoring. A lot of the beer doesn't necessarily need to have hops. That's kind of hard to say in San Diego because they're known for IPAs here and they love
hops. But you don't necessarily need to have hops. But grain is essential, and water is about 95% of beer. So when I was thinking about what challenges breweries would have had, I first want to think about what would be an advantage. And one advantage they'd have is having lots and lots of water. A lot of mountain communities were established along rivers. There's lots of snow melt in the Rocky Mountains, and so they'd have water pretty much year round. It might be harder to get during the winter. You might have to break up some ice to get to the river, but you still get water, really clean water, all year round. And then another advantage would be they have plenty of trees. So either if they're located in a mining town that's mining coal, they can use that for fuel. And if not, in a mining town going after gold or silver or something else, they could use lots of trees around there that weren't being used to build mines. So they have plenty of trees to chop down to fuel their boils and their mashes. Another benefit is it gets really cold in the mountains, and so they could keep their beer for a lot longer. If they built a little cellar to ferment or lager their beer, they would be able to keep it fresh for a pretty good amount of time in the pre-refrigeration era. So there's a couple of benefits they would have had. One, and then going into the more difficult things they would have had come across, is getting grain. So you have to have grain to make beer. You can use other fermentables. You could use, like today, you use rice or corn syrup or other sugars. They wouldn't have had as much access to that as they would have had to grain. And grain would have been difficult to get. Colorado was starting to grow a lot of grain on the Front Range, but that grain first would have had to go through Denver and fill those people. And then they would have sent it up into the mountains, and where it would have gone likely to lots of miners. So you got to feed miners to get you all that gold. And then some would have gone to brewers to make beer. Brewers could use spent grain to help feed draft animals in the mines, so they would have been able to kind of have multiple uses of that grain. But I think it would have been fairly difficult to get grain, so they probably would have made weaker beers, not really, really strong beers that require more grain, but maybe more weaker beers. And then another difficulty you would have had is getting hops. So hops provide a bitterness to beer, some floral elements, and they provide a little bit of kind of the character of beer. So beer and malt provides more of the sweetness, and hops provide a lot more of the bitter. And hops have been really difficult to get. So hops like to grow in the Pacific Northwest and in New England, which are both far away from Colorado and also very different climates than Colorado. Colorado's dry and arid and those places are not. So getting hops would have been pretty difficult, especially fresh hops. So some hops came to Colorado by train. Most came to Denver because that's where a lot of the train stations first came to. And those brewers would have had first pickings over those hops. After that, the leftovers would have gone to the mountains if they wanted them at all. And they'd probably been pretty expensive and they'd probably been pretty picked over. They would have been crushed or otherwise broken in a pretty poor shape. So if we go to the next slide, one thing that I found they could have used is spruce. So spruce has been used in beer for hundreds of years in America and Europe and elsewhere to make beer. And spruce needles would have been in plenty supply up in the mountains, and they provide a very similar taste and purpose as hops. So they provide kind of floral, citrusy taste and smell, and they also help preserve beer, which is part of the purpose of hops. And so if we look through these advertisements here saying, come get your spruce beer, two of these advertisements are talking about more of a temperate beer. So I don't know if that means more of like a root beer or ginger ale like we have today that are like ale and beer but aren't really alcoholic, or if they're just advertising this is more temperate, quote unquote, than whiskey because the percentage would have been lower, which makes sense. If they're using less grain, the beers would have had a lower alcohol content. So they could use spruce to make these beers. And so they could have come by with some of these things, and we do know that they're brewing quite a bit up the mountains. And so this is a likely scenario. They have a little bit of grain, make weaker beer, have some spruce in it, kind of flavor it up a little bit, and then provide it to their communities. And so if we go to the next slide, the Washington House is not the only place to advertise mountain ale or mountain beer. Here are two advertisements in Denver. So we know this was in some degree coming down to the plains, either people mimicking what's going on in the mountains. So some traveler goes up in the mountains, has a spruce beer, says, hey, this is pretty good. Then he goes back home and tells his buddy who's a brewer, they make it, they try it, and then they start to sell it. So that could be one thing that goes on. Another idea would be brewers up the mountains actually are selling their beer down into Denver. And that would have been a little bit harder to do perhaps, but it could have happened. And it's hard to tell with these little advertisements because a lot of beers at the time are named after the place they were brewed or their style. And so in this case, mountain beer could be both a style and a place it's brewed. It's brewed in the mountains or it's a mountain beer. It's hard to tell which one is which. But it implies at least somewhat of a connection between the mountains and the Front Range in terms of beer. If we go to the next slide, we do know there's quite a bit of divisions within Colorado. So this leads me to my second point, talking about how can beer help us understand divisions or connections between Colorado. So there might be some connection between mountain beer and the Front Range, but we definitely know within the Front Range, there are quite a bit of beer competitions. So two cities, Denver and Pueblo, were major competitors in terms of beer, in terms of, well, really everything. Gotta wet my whistle here. Those cities were competing, trying to become the main city where goods would flow west into the mountains to supply miners, and then with their raw materials or whatever they extracted would flow east through and then go to the eastern industries. And so Denver and Pueblo were competing a lot over becoming the major city on the Front Range. And one of those ways that they competed was in terms of beer. So I love this advertisement. This is a Pueblo brewery saying, Pueblo beer is made of the best hops and malt, while Denver beer is said to be made of glycerin and molasses. There's lots of funny advertisements for saying, you know, this Pueblo beer is the best, Denver beer is swill and you shouldn't drink it, or it'll make you sick, or, you know, they've found snake blood in, or whatever. You know, they did all sorts of things saying Denver beer is basically bad for you. But we also see a lot of advertisements that say Denver beer is the best. So we have this frozen beer. I don't, that'd be a topic for another time for another topic, but frozen beer from Denver coming in that people like, everyone takes it, everybody likes it, 100 kegs. They have all these different advertisements in Pueblo for Denver beer. And we don't have a whole lot of advertisements in Denver for Pueblo beer. And so what I think is going on here is that Denver is so located these resources, especially agricultural resources in terms of beer, that they are able to mass produce these beers, produce them way cheaper and a much higher quantity than other cities, and then they begin to export them. So in late 1870s and beyond, Denver breweries have been established of Joe Bates, Philip Zane, In Golden, you have Coors, which isn't Denver, but they might, some places might have combined those two. You have these cities or these brewers in Denver being able to send their beer elsewhere, and other cities starting to resist that a little bit. So Pueblo tried to resist that. There's a Pueblo brewery that was not happy with Denver beer coming to their city. And if we go to the next slide, so here's an example of different beers that are being sold that are basically being advertised on where they're from. So we have Milwaukee, St. Louis, Golden. I think that was Golden, Colorado for basic Coors, or we have lager beer. So beers are being labeled based on where they're coming from. And we see this a lot in Colorado. They're being labeled where they're coming from, not necessarily the specific brewer. So you don't have so much Philip Zang's Denver beer or whatever. You just have either Philip Zang's lager, or more likely just have Denver beer. And then maybe the brewer bartender will say, oh, this one's from Philip Zang, this one's from Joe Bates, this one's from whoever. And so we go to the next slide. Here's some more mountain beer. I might mess this slide up and put it later, but that's okay. That's good advertisement. And if we go on again, we do see this really interesting defense. And this is what I expected to find. So I expected to find a lot of defense. So Pueblo pushing back against Denver beer, but then also a regional divide. So I expected to find, when I was looking into this mountain beer, that the mountains would resist Denver beer. They would say, we're gonna drink our local stuff and we're not gonna drink your stuff. We're gonna support home industry, like this advertisement here, which is kind of something like, drink local almost, don't drink big Coors, drink your local brewery or whatever. I expected to find a lot of that. I expected to find a lot of advertisements, kind of like Pueblo saying, don't drink Denver beer, drink local. We had the best beer. There's no reason to drink something else. So these two advertisements are from Georgetown and then San Juan and Del Norte, which are both kind of mountain communities. I expected to find a lot of that when I went into this kind of regional divide, because today the mountains in Denver are politically very different, and there's lots of separation between the two. You can see it on kind of electoral college maps and vote maps. But if we go to the next slide, what instead we find a lot of is that they're really excited about Denver beer. We find a lot of communities in the mountains. These are both advertisements from in the mountains, but they are all about Denver beer. They are excited to have Denver beer, and they embrace it wholeheartedly. And I don't think it is just because Denver beer is cheaper. I don't think people just drink based on their taste buds or just based on the price. I also don't think they just drink based on their taste buds. A little bit more, maybe Denver beer is better perhaps, but it's likely that their local beer is better because it's probably a whole lot fresher. And it might be their local friend, their friend might be the brewer there, so they go support their guy. But you don't find that a whole lot. We find these advertisements that say we are all about Denver beer. There's one advertisement in Leadville where they had 500 men to hire to unload this carload of beer. That's a lot of beer they're unloading for a town. Like 500 guys to unload kegs could take that's a lot of beer they're moving. And so you find this huge, not just a little trickle of beer, but this huge flood of beer into the mountains. And what you find is people are really excited about this. And so what I think is going on here is that although they might like their local brewer or whatever, in the mountains, what they find is that having access to Denver beer means that they are plugged into this economic system. So Denver has all these resources. And I think that by having Denver beer means that they have access to other things that Denver can provide. It means that their community will be solvent and be able to make money. If they're not connected to Denver, it'd be much more difficult for them to make a living and to provide resources for themselves. But having Denver beer means that they can have other things from Denver. It means that they can sell things back to Denver. It means that they can have this reciprocal relationship with the capital and be able to make money where they are and not have to move and not be pushed outside of their locale. So I think Denver beer for a lot of these people is a sign of maybe economic prosperity or a promise of we're going to make it financially. And we see that today, especially with the ski towns. Skiing exists in many ways because they're connected to Denver. The towns that are connected to Denver via skiing are thriving. The ones that are outside the I-70 corridor are dying. They don't have access to resources from Denver. And so I think beer is one of these early examples of ways that we can see beer bridging these communities together and building kind of a Colorado network. And so my little prop here is this is Breckenridge Brewing. Breckenridge is a mountain town. And they had this beer in Breckenridge, and now it is sold
in Fort Collins and Littleton. It's being brewed there. Not being sold, it's being sold there too, but it's being brewed in Littleton and Fort Collins, which are on the Front Range. So this brewery today is a mountain brewery, but also has breweries on the Front Range. So it's literally connecting these two based on this company. So I think that beer is a way that we can understand these connections and a way that people perhaps see beyond their local community in their local region and see themselves as connected to something that sustains them in a much greater sense. So that's my talk. I want to go more into later on about how these local mountain communities brew their beer on more of a ground level thing. But this is my first foray into this. And so that's my talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Braden Neihart. We appreciate your awesome talk. We are moving on to our next speaker. And I just want to note, I love, thank you folks who are entering questions into the Q&A and chatting in the chat. Everybody sharing the beers they're drinking and where they're drinking from, which is super fun. So thanks a lot. And please go ahead and enter in your questions in the Q&A or the chat whenever you feel like it, and I'll get those to our presenters after the next two. Our next presenter is Megan Ockerman, an independent researcher and former assistant curator for the Olympia Tumwater Foundation, owner of Olympia Brewing Company Archives. Her master's thesis is a history of the Olympia Brewery. Please join me in giving a big, quiet Zoom welcome to Megan Ockerman.
Thank you, Eliza. Okay, so for those keeping score at home, I am drinking Olympia, but it is purely for aesthetics and not because I'm actually enjoying it. Okay, so like Eliza said, my talk is going to be about the brewery, the Olympia Brewery, but I'm just going to go ahead and call it the brewery. And it's intermingling with the city of Olympia and Tumwater. I'm also going to do my absolute best to just stick to my notes, or else I'm going to blow right through my time, because I, like Tiah, could pretty much talk forever. So we're just going to start from the top. The Olympia Brewing Company was founded by Leopold Schmidt and existed under Schmidt family ownership from 1896 to 1983. And since 1983, the brand has been owned by the Pabst Brewing Company. From the 1890s until the 1980s, the brewery was run almost exclusively by the Schmidt family. And like other major breweries of the 20th century, it provided a steady place of work for the surrounding area. Olympia beer was produced in Tumwater until 2003, when the plant was finally closed, and it was closed by Miller, who contract brewed out of there. So next slide, please. The Olympia Brewery is actually in Tumwater, a small town right next to Olympia. As you can see from the photo, they're very close. You can still see both if you're ever driving on Interstate 5 and you're at the curve of Highway 101 and I-5. You can see Tumwater on one side and you can see the Capitol building on the other side. So when Leopold Schmidt started the brewery in 1895, when he started building, the population of Tumwater was around 400 people. And at the brewery's peak in the 1960s and the 1970s, the population was around a whopping 4,000, and it employed over 500 people. So the population of Tumwater at the time, with its two closest towns, Olympia and Lacey, was less than 30,000. So the brewery obviously had a ginormous impact on our economy. Now, Olympia is, of course, you can see by the photo, the capital city, and the largest employer has always been the state and local government. But for its existence, the brewery was always the largest private employer. And as a private firm, it had exponentially more benefits and had way more of a cultural impact on the overall community. So before I get into the perks of working for the brewery that trickled out into the community, I want to try to very, very, very briefly explain how a relatively small brewery, you can see even the post-prohibition brewery is not, it's not huge, how it became one of the largest in the country. For most of its existence, it was only a regional brewery that sold in about 11 Western states. But it really goes back to Leopold, who is the labeled gentleman with the mustache. I thought I would explain him as the guy with the mustache, but it turns out 3/4 of them have mustaches. It starts with him, and he learned the brewing trade in his late 20s when he was in Montana. And he ran and operated the largest brewery in Montana for 20 years before he landed himself in the Northwest. He opened his brewery, which was then called the Capital Brewery, during the Panic of 1893, which was still affecting the economy. But he thought that Tumwater, which had direct rail connections to Portland and to Seattle, and had easy access to deep water ports, like all the way to San Francisco and all the way across the Pacific, that it was a better location because there were no breweries nearby to compete with. It also had the artesian springs that inspired the oh so famous "It's the water" slogan. And he already knew how to make a quality product, and he thought the location was beautiful because it is next to saltwater and mountains. So like most brewing families of the 19th and 20th century, the Schmidts were patrilineal. This ties back to what Tiah was saying, and all of Leopold's sons, most of his grandsons, and multiple son-in-laws throughout the generations entered the family business. And they all gave back to the community. So next slide, please. Leopold had been involved in local and state government when he was in Montana, and his descendants followed that path and also became heavily involved in the local community, serving on various commissions, some in local government, some providing scholarships and memorial scholarships, and by creating the Olympia Tumwater Foundation, which is a philanthropic nonprofit that houses the corporate and family archives in the home of Leopold. It provides scholarships to high school students, and it does own a park next to the brewery. That center bottom photo is of Leopold's son, who was the president at the time, Peter G. Schmidt, who actually created the foundation expressly so he could donate this replica of the Tivoli fountain on the state capitol campus. And I could do a whole talk just on Peter, but when he died in 1957, a local elementary school was renamed after him, and it still bears his name, which I guess I had always heard of it, but it's one of those things where you're like, oh wait, that's named after a brewery owner. And his wife too, I just wanted to mention after listening to Tiah, is his wife was heavily involved in the arts in Olympia and in Seattle. And I would love to know more about Clara, but there's just not a ton. And Leopold's wife, actually, Joanna too, but there's not a lot, although Clara supposedly haunts the Schmidt house, although I can neither confirm nor deny that. But all this is to say, the Schmidts and their large family, which you can't really tell by my presentation, but there were a number of them, were essentially big, unflashy fish in a small pond. They were not really pretentious. They were obviously engaged, but they weren't terribly showy about it. And because of their business, so many other businesses in this area that I am also currently located in exist because of the brewery. One of the most well-known these days is one of the fastest growing credit unions in the state, which is so funny to say, but OB Credit Union started as the Olympia Brewing Credit Union, is just one, and they have just delightful little branches that look like brew pubs. So it's really cute. There's also a canning company. It's now called Crown Beverage. It used to be Crown Cork and Seal, and before that, Continental Can. And from 1959 to 1970, exclusively made cans for the brewery, which now still exists and makes hundreds of different labels. There's also the aforementioned park that I said, which has been renamed recently. It's called Brewery Falls at Tumwater. Oh, I might be messing it up. It was always called Tumwater Falls Park. Most people will know what I'm talking about. And that the brewery created as sort of a buffer zone. It's also beautiful. And they also created a golf course and athletic club nearby in the Tumwater Valley for its employees, but now is open to the public. But okay, now the fun stuff. It was, and still mostly is, at least in my experience by older folks, widely known that the brewery was the best place around to work. And honestly, I'll be honest, I'm a millennial, and it's hard for me to fathom like how crazy it would have been to work here. The benefits that the brewery provided to its employees, who mostly lived within the community, were just outstanding. So it had higher than average wages. had multiple unions. They had annual Christmas baskets that I was on a panel with Tiah about a year ago, and I told her I was trying to research women who worked at the brewery. And most of my interaction with the public is people remembering Christmas baskets, and some people even wanting to be the secretaries who made the Christmas baskets. So there were those, and everybody also received a turkey relative to how large their family was. They got the same on Thanksgiving. They got turkeys. There were dinners for safety achievements, dinners for old timers, dinners for stockholders, dinners for distributors. There were so many dinners involved. There was a charitable giving group who had payroll reductions so they could assist with local charitable organizations in the community, and they helped different groups. There was an annual summer picnic for thousands of people. You can imagine if there's over 500 employees and it was for their families. The undertaking of that every year was probably astounding. There were tons of fishing derbies. There was Friday night bowling leagues all over the place. There were regular, oh so regular golf tournaments. They obviously had to make their own golf course. There were basketball teams, and for a good stretch there, they had the best softball team in the state. And it also held hospitality days for locals who could come visit the plant. And now, the public had always been allowed to come and were welcome at the plant ever since the brewery opened in 1896. But it created an official tour and started keeping a real logbook in 1935, which a lot of breweries did in the latter half of the 20th century. But Olympia was pretty early on to do that. And it made this tiny town have a tourist destination. It had a fun place to stop. And I'm willing to bet large sums of money that at least one person watching live, let alone anybody that watches this recording, went on a tour of the brewery. And if you did, either whether you had beer or like you were too young and you had a root beer at the end of the tour, you should say so in the chat. Next slide, please. So the brewery, like I said, it closed in 2003. And although it's defunct, it's still a huge cultural part of this community. After the merger with Pabst, Olympia Brewmasters in the 80s and early 90s helped small craft brewers get their businesses off the ground by offering free advice, tips, and some junk surplus parts, which solidified beer's place in the area even after the brewery closed. Just to paraphrase from a book about Anheuser-Busch, actually, having a brewery in the city is like having bragging rights. And this area, I think I can say with confidence, this area still feels that really deeply and is deeply, deeply connected to its identity as a brewery city. The city of Tumwater, you can see from these photos, is currently renovating the 1906 brew house and plans to make it part of a hub of Washington's craft brewing industry. And just to note, in the 2017 photo, I had taken a tour of it when an all-volunteer group of older gentlemen, honestly, people that probably shouldn't have been doing construction stuff, were closing up all of these windows and the roofs, and we're trying to just put stopgap measures to stop the weathering. And then the city had specially made bricks designed. They're weird colors of red and they're weird sizes. And they spent a lot of money on this brick that was just finished a few months ago, which is the center photo. And the photo on the right is actually, it's not inside the brew house, but it's in a building next to it. And that's not any kind of sanctioned graffiti. That's just some graffiti that somebody did that's absolutely gorgeous. So next slide, please. I personally have rarely crossed anybody's path that, in the Western United States at least, it's a little bit harder on the East Coast, but in the Western United States, who doesn't have some kind of unique and personal story related to Olympia. They're usually rife with nostalgia, and they're usually funny. They're usually something like, my dad always had a 6-pack of little Ollie's, those little 7-ounce cans when we would go camping. That's what we did when we would go camping. Or I used to float the rivers, and it was a perfect summertime beer because it's basically water. Or anything just that I find absolutely delightful like that. And I think that's a testament to not only the brand recognition that it gained over the years as a regional brewery and then a national brewery, but also that it fostered a feeling of making everybody feel like it was part of its own community, because it was just kind of a fun little working class place that had a lot of character. And we really embrace that here. So that is my chat. That is my Olympia beer homage to this terrible, terrible little drink. But only because it's brewed in California now, so the water is gross.
How can it be good without the water? It's the water. Thank you, Megan. Awesome. Super fun. Love seeing everybody share their stories of going to the plant or getting denied a 7th birthday party at the plant, which is maybe the winner of the stories about those. Thanks for that. That was super awesome. We are rounding it out. In the anchor position of this relay is Dr. Peter A. Kopp, who is Associate Professor of History at the University of Colorado, Denver. He is the author of Hoptopia, A World of Agriculture and Beer in Oregon's Willamette Valley, and he is Jeremy Skinner's favorite historian. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Peter Kopp.
Thanks, Eliza. Thanks, all you panelists. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. What up? It's going to sound weird to say this, but I have been studying and writing about the history of hops and beer for over 12 years. I wrote my dissertation on the Pacific Northwest hop industry, some articles, one for Eliza in the OHQ, and then my book, Hoptopia. Just to reiterate a couple points that Braden made, hops are an essential ingredient in beer. They provide bitterness to the sweetness of the malted grain. They offer aroma for all your IPAs are very aromatic. And maybe most importantly, they have a preservative quality that helps with the shelf life of beer. That's what hops do. They're also a really cool plant on the agricultural landscape. Can you do the next slide, please? So here's an image of hops in the field. They grow up on these trellises like 20 feet high, and they have cones from top to bottom, and they're just really a beautiful and interesting plant. And as I tell everybody who will listen, the Pacific Northwest produces over 1/3 of the world's hops, which means, of course, that over 1/3 of the world's beer has this essential ingredient from it. So by the Northwest, I'm referring to Washington, Idaho, and my home state, Oregon. Go Blazers. Today's talk is not about the Pacific Northwest, though, at least directly. Next slide, please. Early on in my book, I established that there are transnational origins for the American hop industry, and those transnational origins largely lay in England. And so after I finished my, and what I mean by that is that they brought hop rootstock, English colonists brought hop rootstock, they brought knowledge of cultivation methods, and they brought knowledge of how to organize seasonal labor and so on and so forth. So all that was transplanted to North America. In any case, I thought I was done after I published this book in 2016. I thought I was done with hops and beer, but I just kept thinking about these English origins. And so as a lot of historians do, we just keep digging and digging and ask more questions. And so that took me to a couple trips to England, to London, and to Canterbury, where I met this England's foremost hop expert, a guy named Peter Darby, who took his position as England's lead hop breeder in 1983, and he recently just retired actually this spring. I learned so much from him that I decided to continue to do my research on the English origins of hops, and I'm working on an article about Darby and the century-long program, the hop research and hop breeding program in England. So this talk is kind of the greatest hits of this article that I'm wrapping up right now. And essentially what I argue in this essay is that while the technology and science of beer making matured greatly over the past century, the enterprise of breeding hops has largely remained pre-industrial, meaning it's just people working with their hands and without big machines and such. And yet, Darby and his predecessors, who were breeding hops and working with hops, they found equal success through these pre-industrial methods of shaping the world's beer with their novel hop varieties as all of the mechanization of in the world of beer and brewing. So as I unpack that during this talk, I hope to shed some light on how scientists, plant breeders in particular, work diligently behind the scenes to ensure successful crops and commodities, in our case for hops and beer. Next slide, please. So the story begins in Wye, England, here in the southeastern county of Kent, just down the road from Canterbury. On the image on the right, you can see Canterbury, and you can see Ashford. Wye is the train stop. I think it's the second to last train stop from Ashford to Canterbury. So it's just a small place. It's where they have this hop breeding program. But Kent has always been the center of the English hop industry. They grow hops in Surrey and Sussex in the Western Midlands, but Kent is really the heart and soul of hop growing, and that's why the hop breeding program is there as well. Now, in the 19th century, England was at times the world's largest producer of hops. But by the end of the century, because of a rash of plant diseases and because of a rise in the American industry in the Pacific Northwest and competition, the English industry begins a period of decline right in the late 19th and into the 20th century. So as a result, the big English brewers and also the UK brewers such as Guinness, they worked with the government to create a hop research program at Wye College here outside of Canterbury. Next slide, please. The first director of the program was Ernest S. Salmon. He was a plant pathologist by trade, and even more specifically, he was a mycologist, or one who studies fungi. He was an interesting dude. You might even call him a fun guy. Professionally, he had held an esteemed research position in Kew Gardens to the west of London, leading up to his work. And actually, as an interesting bit of history, in 1905, he made it to the single finals of Wimbledon. He was eccentric. He never learned to drive. He always took the train and biked across the country. He never married, but after his death, it became very apparent that he had a robust love life and at least one child as a result. But enough gossip. Salmon took the reins of the hop research program in 1906 and immediately realized that solving England's hop decline would require breeding novel hop varieties. Okay. So please prepare yourself right now because things are about to get very exciting. At the center of Salmon's research program was a worldwide embrace of Mendelian genetics, Gregor Mendel, at the end of the 19th and into the 20th century. And all that really means is that scientists recognized widely for the first time the idea of heredity, or that unique parents pass down unique genes to their offspring, whether plants or animals. So Salmon established a breeding program where he would collect hops from near and far. He gathered them from England. He had colleagues in Oregon. He had colleagues in Manitoba, Canada, even as far away as Japan. So he would collect all these hops, and his goal was to crossbreed them to find the most beneficial hybrids. And it was his idea that these hybrids would save the British hop industry. The actual work, as I said, was pre-industrial and it was tedious. Salmon and his successors would literally swab the pollen from a male onto a female cone. This would fertilize the seeds, they'd plant the seeds, and then they'd see what the new hybrid would look like. But the process took a long time. In fact, it took 7 to 10 years, even from the initial swabbing, to determine if a mature plant could be useful for hop growers and for brewers. So what was the specific problem that Salmon was trying to solve by creating these hop hybrids? In layman's terms, he was trying to increase the bitterness of the hops. If he could increase the bitterness of the hops, they'd be worth more money because you can sell them to the brewers, they can use fewer hops, and so that's ultimately what Salmon's project involved. And the secret here is really interesting in that he was really looking towards the North American hops to breed with the more mild English hops. And in fact, as early as 1908, he got some hops from Oregon, and then he continued to get some later, and the American hops are much more bitter. So he was trying to hybridize American and British hops. And once again, he's using a Mendelian solution to solve this problem. Now, I mentioned it takes a long time to release a hop. Next slide, please. It was not until 1919 that salmon bred a variety that would be released to the public, and that wasn't even until the 1930s. And this is the hop that's the background for my PowerPoint here. That is Brewer's Gold. And then the other two that he's going to release in the 30s and 40s are Bouillon and Northern Brewer. And these take over the agricultural landscape. These new hops that are more bitter, are more valuable for growers. And so this takes off not only in England, but also across the world, and even back in the Pacific Northwest and so on and so forth. Salmon had a lot of other successes that I won't go into, but I wanted you to be sure that you understood the Mendelian solution to England's hop problem. Okay, next slide, please. Salmon eventually retires during World War II. There's a short stint of another scientist, but in 1953, the Hop Research Program appoints Ray Neve, another plant pathologist, as the director. I'm going to say a very few things about Neve because I want to get to Darby. Most importantly, Neve had a much different personality than Salmon. He was difficult. He was difficult. And by the way, he didn't even make it to the Wimbledon finals too, so there's that. But here's the main thing about Ray Neve being difficult, was that he pulled up all of Salmon's old hops. He pulled them out of the ground. He wanted to start from scratch. And in fact, the only hops remaining from the program that started in 1906 were those that were in specific trials in the field already. And there was literally only a handful of them. And so, so Neve really kind of started over, but he left a few aside. Next slide, please. Some of the issues facing the British hop industry at that point were that the picking of hops were becoming mechanized, and so Neve started playing around with what hops could he breed that would be better picked mechanically. But the real problem he solves with Mendelian genetics is disease resistance, particularly two diseases, downy mildew and verticillium wilt, were the scourge of England at this time because acreage continued to go down in the 20th century. So Neve's real successes are in releasing a few hops, several hops, Progress, Northdown, Challenger, Target, and these are all going to be disease resistant to wilt and powdery mildew. Next slide, please. In the late 1970s and in the early 1980s, Neve also makes a name for himself because he is hired to start China's hop industry, which is now one of the largest producers in the world, which is an interesting side. He still did not go to a Wimbledon final, though. Next slide, please. So that brings us to Peter Darby, who's super kind, cool individual. He had an unusual upbringing. He calls it a British colonial childhood. He was born in Plymouth. He moved to Malta. He moved to Hong Kong. He ends up in Scotland. And then he goes to school in East Anglia. And he really thrives in agricultural science. He's also a plant pathologist, so he studies diseases. He never worked in hops before, but in 1983, Neve hires Darby to take over the program. Okay. So the question is, and that I posted in this article is, well, what is the problem that Darby has that he's going to use this Mendelian solution of creating hybrid hops? The first issue was that he inherited a program from Neve to create dwarf varieties. Dwarf hop varieties, unlike the big 20-foot ones that you see in the slide here, they were thought to be more disease resistant. They were thought to be easier to harvest, and they had a whole bunch of other attributes. And so one of the things Darby's going to do is going to release the first dwarf varieties. Next slide, please. Darby also takes over, and his career dovetails with the craft beer revolution. Okay, Okay, so this is a slide of the Foundry Brewery. It's one of the first craft breweries in England. It's in Canterbury. Great beer, wonderful beer, great setting. But if you're in Canterbury, I don't recommend going there because it doesn't have the charm of a British pub. It seems like a pub from Portland, which is kind of weird. Anyhow, Darby believed that the future of the English hop industry was in not necessarily the bittering hops that salmon was interested in, but hops that supply the aroma. And those are the hops of the craft beer revolution, where you smell all these really stinky or lovely IPAs. Those are the aroma hops. And so these are just a few of the issues that Darby is going to try to solve through his hybrid program. Next slide, please. Okay, this is a super cool slide. Darby released this a few years ago. This is the entire heritage of the English hop breeding program. And you can see the very first one, bred by salmon in 1919, is a wild Manitoban in an open English. And then you can see the bullion, you can see the Brewer's Gold, and then all the way down there, you can see what his other colleagues solved. So Darby releases hops that are also disease resistant. He releases some of the first dwarf varieties. The first dwarf variety is also an aphid, or the second dwarf variety is an aphid resistant hop called Bodacia. Next slide, please, because I'm running out of time. Now, because Darby was a curious scientist, something very interesting happened. And here he is in the field with a specific hop I'm going to wrap up with. Darby rediscovered the handful of hops that Ernest Salmon left behind that were in trials that Neve had totally ignored. And one of these was a cross from 1921 of an English hop and a North American subspecies called Neomexicanus. It had been kept alive and replanted over the years. And so Darby planted in his field and he was going to see what happened. Well, when visitors came by, brewers and hop growers, they kept running into this hop and saying, well, this hop smells so good. This is a hop you should release. And so eventually Darby says, okay, this is the random hop that survived a century. Even though it was kind of disregarded for decades and decades. And so this is the last hop that Peter Darby will release, and he's named it Ernest after Ernest Salmon. So it all comes full circle there. And all these hops are becoming the hops of the craft beer revolution, not just in England, but also abroad. So just to wrap things up, I joined Darby for the final harvest last year in Canterbury. He retired this spring, and he's really the last of a generation of these plant breeders that are just swabbing pollen and everything, because now everything has moved towards computers, computer modeled genomes. So people can just scientists can look at the computer and look for the characteristics that they like and then breed those hops. So it's a much more efficient process than it was for the century. In any case, he's a lovely man, and I've been checking in with him this week, and I'd like to tell you that his retirement is going great. The pandemic sucks, but he's getting some relaxation, and he doesn't miss the deadlines. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. As you were talking just now, I was thinking about the first chapter of Hoptopia and how it's all about the plant itself. And now thinking about all of these people who are then manipulating the plant. Also, my dog Darby wants to know why you're obsessed with her and you keep talking about her. So, great timing. We love at-home programs. There's a lot of great Q&A in the chat that's happening. I would love it if folks have other questions that they want to put into the Q&A. There's a question from Molly wanting to know, Peter, are the hops being grown today in New Zealand from the hereditary lines you're describing in England? And can you describe some of the diseases that are attacking hop plants? Are they the same as other locales in England? So I'll leave that to you and put my mute on.
So here's a really interesting thing that I didn't say, which is that the English line of hops started every single effort that breeders have tried to make in the past century to have more bitter hops, because by the 80s we have things that are called super alphas, and they're very, very, very bitter, which is more economic. But so those became the parents for breeding programs across the world, including New Zealand and such. And so at our current moment, there's so much exchange, right? The last day of the harvest with Derby, for example, the last hop they were picking was Cascade, which was a hop released in Oregon. So there's a lot of sharing going on. There's a second part of the question, which was what?
Which was, you're describing diseases attacking hop plants, and what are the types of diseases, and are they the same elsewhere as they are in England?
Yeah, so the main diseases for hops are powdery mildew, downy mildew, verticillium wilt, and then aphids, which is not a disease, but those are the four biggies, and they plague hops everywhere. And because there's so much exchange of germplasm of hop roots for breeding, they're always introducing new varieties of diseases and pests to other places too. So it's one of the benefits and also problems of the global exchange. Thanks for that question.
Yeah, thank you. So there's another question that has to do with competition among inexpensive beers. And I'll just note, this questioner has learned from someone like my mother, who says there's a difference between cheap and inexpensive, Megan. The inexpensive beers, the competition is Rainier versus Olympia. Were there advertisements that made that competition happen? Did they rate each other's brewing staffs? Why was there so much competition between Rainier and Olympia?
They definitely did not rate each other. That's a good distinction. Olympia was not cheaply made. It was always made with quality ingredients, but it was inexpensive. Seattle's history is very complicated, and there were multiple different owners, but throughout its weird, crazy, complicated history, all the owners, they've got along. So there was definitely no poaching of people. It was pretty much purely advertising. And actually most people I think around here are more familiar with Rainier than they are Olympia. It seems like Rainier is actually more popular around here, and Olympia was a little bit more popular in the West, but not so much in this region itself. But it had a lot to do with advertising, I will say, and Olympia pretty much stuck to the same advertising its entire existence. It was always a light beer and a light table beverage, and its recipe didn't really change after World War II, when all beers had to be less alcoholic and lighter in flavor and color and taste. But yeah, after Prohibition, Seattle also had a tougher time getting back in the market, because it had different ownership after Prohibition and had transferred its brand down to California. So the post-Prohibition owner, Emil Sick, had to eventually buy that back. It took him about 15 years to actually buy that brand back. And then they had to sort of reinvent their own marketing in Seattle. So it's kind of parallel but different stories, but they basically are the same. I don't let anybody tell me otherwise. They're basically the same, and it's almost purely marketing.
The scholars bring out the truth, and I have people who disagree, but we'll see. There is a question, and I'll just toss this out. Braden and Peter, I don't think you all had the opportunity to speak very much about women in brewing and hops in some of your research. Are there any stories or things that you would like to share about women's history in your work?
Yes, as Tiah knows this, Tiah and I have worked with several women in the hop side of things. The current head of the Oregon Hop Commission is Gail, help me out, Tiah. Gail Goshi. Yeah, Gail Goshi is awesome. She's wonderful. This, like Tiah said in her talk, the women often took the background, and there's not a lot of records behind them. But when you do oral histories with people, you find out often that, oh, it's actually the the female head of household that was doing the work in the field and such. So I have struggled because they're just not part of the historical record. But whenever I have oral histories, I always am sure to include those. What do you think, Braden?
Yeah, I agree with what's been going on. There's one in Leadville. There's a brewery in Leadville that's kind of family run, and the wife is part of it, but not her role is very indistinct. But the husband doesn't seem like he's involved with it at all. So it makes me think that she was actually running the show. It was just named after him. So I'm not quite sure. I'm sure that they were running lots of things behind the scenes, but it's very difficult to get, exact things. It seems like nowadays in Colorado, though, there are a lot of prominent women brewers. And so it's kind of come back where the women are actually getting credit for what they're doing. There's lots of breweries. In Fort Collins, I know that there's many women-led breweries, which is kind of exciting and kind of neat. And really good beer.
Of course. There's a question for Dr. Kopp. You mentioned Neo-Mexicanus hops, which this questioner is saying in their experience in the brewing industry, they're often used as what they call experimental hops. And as often happens in talks with historians, you're being asked to speak about the present and the future. Who better? But really, it is an interesting question. What are your opinions on the advantages or disadvantages of new hop varieties that are being bred for distinct flavors versus hops with those long traceable genetic history? So from your research, are you able to address some of that?
Yeah, I like that question. Thanks. Neo-Mexicanus is really pungent. It's really sinky. So Sierra Nevada made it famous. I can't remember what year it was, but they released a beer with Neo-Mexicanus. And whoever asked the question is right. It's just craft brewers are trying to throw everything they can out there. So if they can get a beer and get people excited about a Neo-Mexicanus or some other kind of hop that nobody's ever tried, then it's all about the marketing. I didn't think the beer was that good, but everybody has their own tastes. The problem with hop breeding today is that, and it's another reason why things have shifted, is you can now patent plants. This is something that occurred over the 1980s and 1990s. And so everybody is taking a cascade and breeding it with a random hop in a field somewhere, and then they're calling it, Titan or something like that. And you can't keep track of it now. Or now they have all these letters and names. I can't keep track of it anymore. It's all, but the idea is that the work of the Darbys or the work of the Al Honnold, who is Oregon's hop breeder, it's all, that's gone by the wayside now. It's all become privatized and difficult to trace and track. And sometimes it's just gimmicky, It's really, some people release a new hop and it's really just a cascade,
So we're just going to follow up on that quickly because someone wants to know if the classic hop varieties will be overshadowed by new strains being developed, such as the Idaho 7, which now I wonder, is that just a cascade? Or will they stay competitive and relevant? So what do you think from what you've seen?
Yes, both. I mean, the cascade was a result of a Fuggle, which is a classic English variety. And now Cascade has taken over the world of craft beer, whether it's here or South Africa or New Zealand or England. So I think that some of the standards like Fuggle and Golding and then even the new American hybrids like Cascade, they'll have lasting power. But just like I tried to show that the three major hop breeders in the English program were addressing different issues in time, I think we're going to see different changes in hops as well.
Thank you. Megan, you may have touched on this, but are there plans to refurbish the Olympia Brewery? We know the Rainier Brewery in downtown Seattle is refurbished and you can go there and have a fantastic time, make all your friends jealous. Is that possible for Olympia as well?
Yeah, so the renovation of the brew house, the plans right now, because it's not going to be done for another 5 to 7 or so years, there's 4 buildings on that footprint, and only one of them, the brew house, is owned by the city of Tumwater. It was donated to the city in 2016, and they're renovating it. There are a lot of logistical problems of being able to get people down there because it is down a hill. There's no parking. it's going to be connected to the county trail system. So multiple parks near there, you can walk to it, but they're not really sure yet how people will actually be able to access it. There's plans to be, you know, retail, museum space, possibly other, like a brew pub or something. They're not even really sure of the future plans. But so there's a lot of logistical things in the future after it's actually renovated. Now the post-prohibition brewery is owned, it's like 39 parcels owned by 13 or 14 different groups. None of them are doing anything with any of it. It's just crumbling. It's constantly being raided for copper wires or accidentally set on fire or vandalized. And I do believe actually the city fines the largest owner every single day that he's not doing something with it because it's just becoming a liability. And it, unfortunately, it's more than likely, don't anybody quote me, but more than likely down the road, just probably going to be too much of a burden to refurbish because it's so large of a warehousey type building that's probably chock full of asbestos that will probably just be demolished at some point. But right down the road in the Tumwater Valley, there is new construction that is part of this push by the city of Tumwater to bring brewing back and being the hub of the state for craft brewing. So the local community college is working with local business leaders and local breweries, local restaurants, and other business owners to teach people how to brew outside of their bathtub and tie it all back into the history of the area. So it's all kind of coming full circle, just really slowly and kind of sadly limping along the way.
Thank you. Well, no time for delays like COVID time. Sounds like it'll be ready by the time we have a vaccine, so that's perfect. Tiah, I was going to ask that question about your advanced Googling because I think it would be great for other folks to hear. But really, if you can give some tips for folks on how to seek out and find women who have been hidden in so many histories. Can you give us a few tips for that?
I would say one of the greatest things that I never thought I would love are like society columns. And so there are lots of historical newspaper databases. There's Chronicling America through the Library of Congress, different state agencies like or state organizations like the University of Oregon has historic Oregon newspapers, and I think the Secretary of State in Washington runs historic newspapers. Anyway, so finding those historic newspapers, doing Google searches or doing searches within those for people's last names. I found a lot about Louisa using Mrs. Weinhardt, not using her name. Her name is spelled lots of different ways. So I got a lot of results with Mrs. Weinhardt. So I think that you got to find the kernel or the like pull in the sweater. And that's when you pull that out, and that's when you start finding more details. The more details you have, then the more that you can search. So historic newspapers are amazing. Society columns record all sorts of things. Like Mrs. Weinhardt went to visit her brother, Godfrey, in the Central Oregon. And so I knew that was her brother, and I could pull on that family tree a little bit. So it's often finding that original kernel, that original corner that's the hardest. I think the way that I have been thinking more recently too is if you know that a woman is associated with a club or an organization, researching around that. So I talk to students a lot about you find something that they did and you research around that. And so you don't know exactly what they did, but you can make some guesses about the way that clubs in Portland operated, or the way that the government dealt with vice and prostitution. So I think that the thinking around, if you don't have the specifics, you know that somebody lived in a place at a time. And so talk about what was happening in that place at that time. That first little kernel is often the hardest to get though. And I joke about advanced Googling. I have been a librarian for a really long time, so I do have some mad Googling skills. But it's often thinking about what different ways to say the same thing. Different ways to search the same thing.
That makes a ton of sense. Thank you for those great tips. This has been the best PCB session of all time. I think no one can doubt it. Thank you all so much. And thanks to all of you for your incredible work and your scholarship and your Googling skills and your research and your writing. We're all really the better for it. And we couldn't be more grateful for all that you're doing to help us understand the past and apply it to our present. This is really just fantastic. So we will put a little edited version of this recording up on the OHS website so folks can share that out. It'll be on our YouTube channel in 2 to 4 weeks. So I'll just say thanks, everyone. And I can't wait till we're drinking beers in person together again. So take care and have a wonderful evening.